about 3:30. So welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to have all of you here today. My name is Dr. Carol. I am the new anthropologist on campus, and it's an honor and a pleasure to introduce you to Teresa. I have to cheat on your name, Bertosi. She's coming to us from Western Michigan University, and she's going to be talking about celebrated patterns of protests, indigenous environmental movements, and anti-mining methods. So it's going to be an interesting session going here. After she does that, I'm going to actually be talking about some of my work looking at cultural issues associated with Kennecott. And as a cultural anthropologist and also someone interested in archaeology as well and trained in both, this is something close to my heart as well. So I've only had the opportunity to talk on the phone with Teresa, so I'm really excited that she's in this session today. We may or may not have one other person joining us, and if not, what I'll do is open it up to questions, and we can do it one of two ways. We can either have questions after each talk, or we can have all of the questions at the end. So by a show of hands, who would like to have all the questions at the end? Okay, and how many people would like to do the questions as we go? Okay, we'll just do that because we're okay on time. We're not really pressed for time, so it's all right. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Teresa. Welcome, and I will go ahead and turn the floor over to you then. Thank you.
Who's running the projector? You? Okay. Could you help me for a minute? I think this PowerPoint is a little different than mine for some reason. It's probably a newer version. Where's View Show?
Yeah, I actually haven't.
You don't know either?
No, I haven't used this yet, but I'm pretty sure it's this symbol slideshow.
Oh, okay, thanks.
Start?
Sure. Oh, I guess I need to talk in here, huh? You all set? Am I going to disturb people in other rooms by having the door open, or? We're actually checking to see how it is filming with doing that way. Oh, okay. Are we all set? All right. Again, I'm Teresa Bertossi. I will be graduating actually this Saturday with a master's degree in natural resources analysis and environmental management. I recently finished my thesis I examined the tactics used by mining corporations in the Upper Peninsula, specifically with the Eagle Project. But I found kind of another interesting niche along the way, and that was kind of a more positive thing, not looking at the problems everywhere, but how people, and specifically Indigenous people who are kind of taking the lead role in this matter, are actually halting and stopping mining projects globally. So that's kind of what I'm going to talk about. If you have questions about the Eagle Project, I won't be talking about that too specifically. I can probably answer your questions, so feel free to to ask if I don't talk enough about it. So, anyway, let's begin here. So one of the topics I looked at with my thesis was the public relations strategies that mining corporations use when they come to communities, when they come to tribes. And I'll talk a little bit about what I found. And then in response to those public relations strategies, what's left for Indigenous people or rural or local communities near these projects to do? So I'm going to talk about that a little. And how does that threaten mining corporations? What kind of power do we have as individual citizens? Especially when our governments, or if we live in a democratic country, just if those are failing us. So, and then I want to spend a little more time talking about the successful Indigenous movements around the globe. There are a number of them. I'm finding more every day. Today I handed out a sheet of 8. There are many more. When I say successful, it doesn't always mean that these mining projects or large projects, maybe a large hydropower or project or something of that sort, necessarily that they've stopped them, but a lot of times they've done some pretty good damage to the efficiency of the project, perhaps. So, and then finally, some suggestions for Indigenous communities when they're facing these large corporations, some tactics, some things to remember based upon those public relations strategies and corporate tactics that I found. So feel free to jump in anytime, ask questions. So first of all, what I found were these, I kind of categorized these 4 strategies that I found. I looked at a lot of books that were specifically called corporate public relations strategies, written from people who work for mining corporations. I explored the Crandon Mine and Flambeau Mine in Wisconsin and looked at some of the strategies that were there for my thesis project, or that were used there, and compared them to some of the things that have been going on here in Michigan. So anyway, some of the strategies. First of all, secret purchasing of land and mineral rights. Sometimes without the knowledge of Indigenous people or people who own properties, mining corporations are just, exploring, and they don't always ask for permission. So they buy up these huge pieces of land and mineral rights. Another one, which I'll talk mostly about, are the negotiation strategies. And globally, what I found is that these mining corporations will come into a community and they'll set up what they call a community advisory group. They do this in many communities, and people think that their voice is going to be heard from the company, so they participate in these community advisory groups. There's one that the Kennecott Minerals Corporation developed here locally as well. So another is the consensus process. This is a strategy I actually found in a corporate strategy book, something that they do. They come into a state that may not have regulations for certain kinds of mining, uranium mining, or maybe not necessarily a state, but a province even. I'm trying to keep this a global perspective and not just locally. So anyway, the consensus process is very similar to the community advisory groups. Basically, they get people to sit down with them, and a lot of times what it does is it co-opts this energy that's beginning to develop in opposition to certain projects. So they have all of these experts, and they have a lot of money to hire a lot of experts, a lot more than we do. Even our big organizations, like here in the U.S., the National Wildlife Federation or the Sierra Club, these mining corporations are working with a lot of money. So they have the experts to attend these consensus processes to make sure that the rules and regulations are in their favor. And I attended all of the meetings for the regulations for the non-ferrous metallic mining Part 632 here in Michigan, and I witnessed this for myself. I went in believing in the process, but after a few days, what I found was that the lawyers, every time the environmental folks would bring something up, the lawyers would threaten the Department of Environmental Quality with a takings or some other sort of threat, and it was just a very difficult process that the mining company had more say in than anybody else. So another negotiation strategy is gifting. They come into communities, for instance, in Big Bay, and they give, for instance, they gave a defibrillator to the community. A lot of communities aren't prepared for this, for whether to accept these gifts or not to. And sometimes, if you accept it, it looks as though you're supportive of their project, and sometimes that's how it's portrayed in the media. So I know Big Bay has kind of learned a lesson, and they're considering putting a group together to deal specifically with gifting. So if any of you are from other communities possibly affected by these mining corporations or big projects, that might be something to consider. So and then finally, risk assessment and mass media campaigns. The risk assessment strategy that corporations use is basically they help write legislation that allows them to pollute to some degree. They call it maximum daily loads, maximum contaminant levels, certain things like that. So they allow certain amounts of pollution, basically. And then, again, mass media campaigns, commercials, different things like that. So, showing birds maybe flying over blue sky by their mine or deer running in the background, things like that. So typically they do have, deer and birds. They want people who are seeing these very quick bits of commercial to associate their project with this, beautiful natural world. So that's also a strategy. So based on all of these strategies, Mm-hmm. The first day, actually, I attended because Gail Griffith, who's sitting in the front here, couldn't make it. She was the president of the Eagle Alliance at the time, so I went the first time wearing the hat of an Eagle Alliance member. And they weren't going to let me join at the table. I stood up probably 5 times and requested that I be a part of the process. And eventually I think one of the arguments was, well, you're allowing multiple Kennecott lawyers sit at the table. And they were saying that they already had representatives from local groups who were opposed to the project and that we didn't need to be a part of it. So, yes, eventually they did allow us to participate. I guess I did a lot more listening because I wasn't an expert on, a lot of the topics that they discussed. But I did a lot of listening, and, I threw in a few comments here or there. So, yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about risk assessment and how it functions, how it operates?
Yeah, I guess in a lot of communities, what they do, here's a good example that might help you understand it a little more. Have you heard much about the Utah Salt Lake City incident with Kennecott? Basically, they did a risk assessment about this berm that was set up behind these people's houses with all these, this toxic liquid that was behind it. And the risk assessment was, if all of these people die, let's put a price on their lives. Are we going to lose more money if these people die, or are we going to lose more money if we build this berm better? Does that help you kind of understand it? So basically, Their main objective is profit, and they look at what they have to risk to make the most profit.
But, I mean, well, you're talking about like a community advisory group, consensus process, gifting. How does that risk assessment fit into that? I mean, because the rest of those things are like ways in which that they're trying to, so they don't share their risk assessment with the community.
Right, and it's not always an actual risk assessment document. Sometimes the risk assessment is they present to the public that a certain amount of a chemical in their drinking water or particulates in their air is okay. So that's how they present it to the public. You can be exposed to this much pollution and it's not going to affect your body. The problem is that typically those amounts aren't based on women and children. They're typically, or accumulation, they're based on usually a 180-pound adult male. Does that help?
Yeah, so this is like just another example of how they're experts. They hire these guys to do these
Right.
risk assessments, right?
Right.
But it's like, well, don't worry about it, just cool out and whatever.
Sure. Yep.
And then that's what they tell the community as part of this PR campaign for.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and sometimes it's these actual risk assessment documents, too. It's kind of all grouped. I kind of grouped it all into one. So does that help? Any more questions about that? Yeah.
I was going to say, how about there's some starting like nonprofit organizations to lobby for families?
Yeah, that's another tactic, definitely. That's something a lot of, I guess that kind of evolved with the wise use kind of movement where they kind of started these nonprofit organizations to help them out. So yeah, that's certainly a tactic. Is that kind of your question?
Well, I was just going to say, do you have
Examples?
how they go about
Not specifically. I would imagine they find proponents in the community and talk to them and see if they want to form something. I guess I can't really talk on that too much. Anything else? Okay, so with all of these tactics up against all of this money, how do Indigenous movements, grassroots movements, ever succeed? And they do, believe me, they do. I was surprised to find as many successful movements as I did. Having been heavily involved in the Kennecott movement, sometimes it seemed like you're never going to beat these guys. They've really got some deep pockets. So what I found was this spin model. And this man by the name of Gerlach developed this model in the 60s based on a lot of the environmental movements that were beginning at that time. So he looked at how do these grassroots movements, these indigenous movements, what are their tactics? How are they designed? And it's in that design that they are successful. It's for that reason, and I'll talk more about that design, that we all have power up against such deep pockets, sometimes corrupt governments. That's why these movements succeed. So SPIN, S-P-I-N, is an acronym for Segmentary Polycentric Integrated Network. Segmentary simply means that we have a lot of different groups forming, grassroots groups. So it's difficult for the mining company to come up with a campaign sometimes for their commercials and ads and strategies because there are so many different groups doing so many different things. So that's kind of what segmentary means. Polycentric simply means that there's no main leader. There may be people that show up in the newspapers more often than others, probably because they're more comfortable talking to the media, but these aren't typically one large coalition. There's a lot of different groups, again, with a lot of different people, no main leader. So that helps because there's no particular person usually to blame for something or for a mining company to try to negotiate with or to meet with to try to control the movement. And then another part of the spin model is this integrated network. And this stood out among the rest as a tactic, especially in Indigenous movements, that has been very successful, in which people who are part of these movements make connections with other provinces, other states, other tribes, other countries, people in other countries. It's these networks. It's the family members of these people, the friends of these people that they bring in. That is one of the strongest tactics against these big mining companies, not just mining companies, other companies as well. I guess I say mining a lot because that's what I've been studying. So when I say that, I mean other corporations as well. But so this correspondence we're seeing, and I'll show you some successful examples of this, where people contact other communities and they say, well, you faced the same company. What did you experience? And again, even the little whispers and the gift of gab and the oral histories and the oral, stories that are shared, that's one of our strongest tactics, in my opinion, and based upon my research. So enough about that. Any questions about those? So again, this spin model is one of our strongest tactics, but within that is this networking, and that's what the whole model is based on. And those tactics I talked about with the mining corporations, they would never have had to develop those tactics or try to persuade us and try to negotiate with us if we didn't have the power to stop these projects. They'd just go ahead and do it. So I think that in itself, the fact that they've developed these tactics is evidence that we can be successful. So, grassroots movements, Indigenous movements, can be very expensive for these projects. Currently, Kennecott has been delayed longer than I think they planned to in this community. And we're seeing this all over the place, even, I'll get to my examples later on, but Indigenous people aren't always stopping these projects, but they're certainly delaying them, and that's very expensive. And if you can do that long enough, then they can't really afford to do the project. So another result from these organized movements is the rippling effect, and that's kind of why I use this background with the pool of water that you'll see on all my slides is, you throw a stone in the water, and this is that idea of networking, oral histories, conversations. So one of the biggest dents in these projects is that we know, specifically in the movement here in the UP, that sulfide mining has not been successfully done anywhere else. And why? Because we've been in communication with all these other places, and that's how we know. We've gotten their stories. And, some of the Indigenous people in Australia who maybe don't have as much access to communication, such as the Internet, their stories still make it here, and sometimes it's with the press, but sometimes it's simply a visitor goes there and someone in, one of the Indigenous people tell them a story of what has happened. So, again, that's my example of the rippling effect. And then, back up a little, but so basically it's reputation. We can really, if we don't stop a project, we can really hurt their reputation. And when they get to another community, they're going to be a lot stronger and ready to step up to stop a project. And I believe that we're seeing this now. And this sheet that I passed out to all of you, this list of stopped mines, I think this is just going to increase. And I think specifically leading this are Indigenous people around the world. And we're seeing it a lot more. And I think evidence of that is that mining companies there are entire colleges popping up, like geology colleges, where they talk about how to get consent of the local people, where they're studying that. So I think that shows the success and evidence that this is really increasing, these success stories, and people stepping up against mining companies. And then, again, it's kind of the same thing as expensive delays, just efficient mine operation. Sometimes some of these stories I'll share with you, basically people will roll boulders or park their cars in front of these mining trucks, and the mining companies can't do anything. They can't get around it. So just attacking the efficiency of these projects is also very helpful. Any questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Well, did you get the feeling that, like, overwhelmingly, this community was not in favor of this mine?
Here in the UP?
I mean, just from the public hearing.
You know, I really, really believe, and I'm definitely biased, but I really, really believe that the majority of the people in the Upper Peninsula are opposed to this project. I just sat at a table at the recreation show, kind of where they sell, boats and canoes and kayaks over the weekend, and I had miners walking up to me, and they said, we're from Negaunee, and all of Negaunee is against this, and I worked for CCI for all of these years, and we're against it. And probably one of my best partners at the beginning, who I drove to all these regulations or rules meetings with, was a CCI, worker for many years and was ready to retire. So I think that many of the tribes have made it clear they're opposed. Of course not everyone, but I think the majority, yes.
Well, then, I mean, if that's true, because this is really the sense that I get.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I mean, I think a lot of people feel like, well, this is really good example of, the community is against it, right?
Yeah.
The Indigenous population is against this. Most youthers are against this. Yet these decisions are made at a level that it doesn't matter what we want on a regional level, because these guys are taking this money and paying off these guys downstate, and that's just the bottom line.
Yeah, that is the bottom line. And it's difficult to bring it to a vote. And it's very difficult to do that in the state. A lot of people have been looking at it. We're talking millions of dollars to get it on the ballot, or thousands of people, and quite a few years. And sometimes we just don't have that kind of time. But a lot of these, so you're right. I won't keep going on. Does that help answer your question? Okay. Yeah, you're definitely right. Our voice and the voice, even more so of Indigenous people, it's not being heard. They're not being, the state, especially here in Michigan, is not respecting their treaty rights out there on the plains, or many places in particular. Kennecott right now is exploring on KBIC's within their reservation boundaries, and, no one's listening to them. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The point I'm making is that I'm wondering who is censoring her mail and all of the letters we send via U.S. mail and via the internet email. Why isn't she hearing us?
I'll let you respond before I do. She knows the address. Barb.
Well, I know just for the hearings in September, kind of had clarification. They received 4,000. The DEQ received 4,000 comments. And one comment alone was 750 pages from the KBIC and National Wildlife Federation. The four groups that are suing the DEQ starting next Monday. The contested cases. But the majority of those 4,000 comments were, of course,
Yeah. So she knows.
Yeah.
She knows. I think.
She has some clue. She's into that, but she doesn't want to deal with the issue.
Another issue is the economic, well-being of the state right now. And so I think that it's easy as a political leader to sort of, maybe look the other way, even though under everyone's noses, all of the evidence clearly indicates that there is a direction in terms of where people are at with not only the environment but also the cultural issues that are happening. So I think it's diligence and perseverance and being consistent with everyone and using what you talked about, which is not just targeting one person, but flooding every avenue you possibly can. This is not going away. So but it's definitely something that no one wants to touch. Especially it's a hot potato. And I'm not trying to take it. I'll talk later.
I think everyone else pretty much answered that question for you, but I would like to add that she has somewhat of a history of this. If you look at her history with Dow Chemical, the EPA is questioning her work with Dow Chemical, and right now there's investigating going on, and she was just up here when she gave that interview, using them as a poster child for bringing solar power to the state of Michigan. So it's, seems like there's a history of this too. So, well, you've had long enough to read my little quote here, but I think that it's hard to stop these projects. It takes a lot of work, but what I'm going to get into soon is that, how are we doing for time? Okay. We're okay? Okay. Does that mean we're okay? Sort of?
I think we're okay. We only have two of us. If everyone is okay with that.
There's three of us.
There are three of us.
Oh, okay. Let me speed it up a little. Yeah. Anyway, I think it can be done. It's tough to force your voice when no one's listening. But I think that especially the Indigenous people around the world are showing that it can be done, and they're definitely leading this movement, and it's getting bigger. And I think that covers a lot of what you guys said. It's tough. It's tough to spread our story. It's expensive if you do it by based on media, but we don't need money. I think we can do it with our networking, capabilities. So anyway, that's the gist of that quote. So I am almost done here, but this is kind of the key part of my presentation are some examples of these successful movements, and some of them are very current. Specifically, we're seeing a lot of positive action in South America, especially in Argentina. And it's because of Indigenous people and their perseverance against these big corporations, public protests, public outcry, that provinces are beginning to create laws where the locals can regulate and restrict mining activities. In the state of Michigan, unfortunately, a lot of those rights were taken from the local townships and such, but I think the tribes, still have, I don't think Part 632 it doesn't have the power to take away sovereign authority in that area. So anyway, again, in Argentina, there's no open pit metal mining. There's no cyanide leaching allowed anymore because of public outcry. And the company that's trying to mine in Escal remains blocked currently. So also in Mendoza, we are seeing a lot of protests, a lot of people demonstrating, and open pit mining has been suspended indefinitely. Cerro Quiliche Mountain in Peru, in September 2004, citizens got fed up with Newmont Gold. Approximately 300 people were poisoned by mercury that was spilled on a 35-mile stretch. This really got people upset, but if that wasn't enough, the mining corporation threatened their main source of drinking water, which is Mount Quiliche. So in September of 2004, 10,000 people, 10,000, within 2 weeks, they kept coming. And they rolled in boulders, and they parked their cars, and they said, "This is our sacred mountain, and you're not going to get to it." And so the mining company helicoptered their workers in, and again, talking about attacking the efficiency of a project. You can't possibly helicopter your workers in all day. So the government had to pay attention, even though they have a history of corruption working with corporations. The people stopped this mining project, and it wasn't a small one. Gold prices are rising currently, so this is a pretty big project that was stopped. This is a picture of some of those people. I just thought that, I guess when I was researching, this is one of the first pictures I found, and I just found it very powerful. It was very peaceful. I think 1 or 2 people were hurt, but in 10,000, it's not too bad. This is just not just, but one of the main leaders of the movement there in Peru, Marco Arana. He helps talk between the indigenous people and the corporations because he knows English, along with a few others. Other successful movements in the U.S., there are more than just Crandon, but this is, it was a 30-year battle. It was a long battle, but the Mole Lake Chippewa eventually bought the mineral rights. And they didn't really have the money. They came up with it. They all worked together. They came up with it. And the mining company was willing to sell out because they had been held off for 30 years. This mine switched hands between a number of different mining corporations, and none of them were successful. Costa Rica, again, public outcry. They outlawed all new open pit mining. Irian Jaya, again, public outcry. Unfortunately, the folks of West Pawpaw have faced a lot of really bad stuff there, but we're seeing some success currently in West Pawpaw. Specifically, we're seeing this networking where they're coming to the U.S. and they are suing these mining corporations. So the indigenous people, they're coming on over here to get them if they can't do it there. So, and then again in northern British Columbia, due to public outcry, the environmental or the government there kind of put a halt to that because of, again, public outcry. Currently in Ontario, we are seeing protesting in the earliest stages of these projects, in the exploration stage of uranium mining. So it's starting to get earlier and earlier. It's not after something bad happens, like with the mercury spill. It's people are learning and they're starting that earlier. Currently, Paula Sherman and Bob Lovelace are in jail because they were protecting their land. The mining corporation sued them, and actually Paula Sherman is not in jail, but they tried to send her to jail. Bob Lovelace is currently in jail, and you can find his address on the internet if anyone wants to write him. Okay. And currently we are seeing, I believe, a very successful movement right here in the UP. I think KBIC has they made a lot of really good decisions that I feel a lot of the environmental organizations may not have, and mostly refusing to negotiate with Kennecott. And they did this by avoiding meeting with them, by telling them we're opposed to your project and, that's it. So they avoided the negotiation strategy. I have 1 minute left here, but suggestions for successful resistance. For those of you who are fighting big projects, I have 2 slides left, so I'm almost done. Work toward a consent requirement for legislation. We're seeing this around the globe where they're saying, no, get the consent of the local community. So that has a lot of power, and that allows for a no mine option, not just a heavily regulated mine option. And again, a no mine option is okay. There are alternatives to all of this metal. If we mine our landfills, one member of one of the local organizations found that mining our landfills would supply 35 Eagle projects worth of metal. Speak up, organize. Indigenous movements around the globe are, they're stopping these projects or at least halting them. This is the Algonquin in Ontario, their symbol that they're using, demand environmental justice. And you do have the power to create this rippling effect by simply telling stories to people and spreading the word around. So I think that's it. I don't know if we have time for questions. Okay.
One quick one. Number 3, Sarah mentioned the mercury spill. Did that jump into a particular river?
It very much did. Their water supply, their local rivers, when the vice president of Newmont went there himself to look at it, there were no fish swimming in the rivers any longer. It wasn't just because of that spill. What happened was the people saw the little bit of gold that was in that mercury alongside the roads, and they went and picked it up and took it home and thought if they boiled it, they could get the gold out of it. Well, then they were all exposed to mercury poisoning. So that's what it was, more than the drinking water for that particular incident. Yeah.
What's the current state now of the Kennecott mine? Current state of affairs?
Will you be talking about that at all, Alex? So that we can get you up the current. Okay, I'm going to let her talk about that. I think I've taken up enough time. There's other people that need to speak. But thanks for the question.
Get me a minute here and I'll load up my PowerPoint. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. So I can do this one of two ways. I have a formal talk, or I can just sort of talk as we go. So it's kind of your preference. But one moment, I'm going to. Okay, my name's Alex Carroll. I am a sociocultural anthropologist by training, and I minored in archaeology. And so when I came to the university almost a year ago now, I was talking about the ghost dance. And one of the things I was looking at was revitalization movements among indigenous populations. And one of the areas that I was looking at was in Nevada. And there was an area where there were actually two mountains. They were called the Twin Sisters. And they used to be exactly the same size. So if you were to look at a picture, you would, know why they were called the Twin Sisters. They were identical. Well, there was a point in time during the life of Wovoka, who was the leader of this indigenous movement, where he prophesied that at the end of time that one of those mountains would reach the ground, that it would no longer actually be a tall mountain. And so this was an important part of one of the cultural landscapes. I was looking at a place where people would go in order to perform sacred ceremonies to help put the land back in balance. So when I went there, the two mountains were no longer the same size. One was really, really tall, and the other was almost to the ground. I said, well, what happened to the mountain? Any guesses? Kennecott mining had gone into the area and almost leveled one of the mountains. So that was my first introduction to Kennecott. So anyway, unbeknownst to me, when I came to this university, I started talking about Kennecott because it was part of the area I'd been working in. And then I started learning about some of the issues happening here. So my training has been to, in places where there are sacred sites, to provide my expertise, to look at whether there is a cultural impact. And so once I learned that there was mining, that Kennecott was interested in doing mining on the Yellow Dog Plains, I started investigating whether, in fact, there would be a cultural impact, and if so, what that would be. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about that. This research looks at the archaeological footprint. It also looks at some sociocultural issues and also the linguistics. In other words, sometimes you can go back in time and look at how people talked about a landscape, and it will tell you who was there and what they were doing. So when I first started investigating it, what I was told was there wasn't a cultural imprint. And actually, when I called the state archaeologist, he said, don't bother, there's nothing there. So I said, okay, and send me the materials that you have, and I'll decide for myself. So the Salmon Trout River is one of two watersheds on the Yellow Dog Plains, and this is a contested landscape. And by contested, I mean that a lot of people are interested in what happens here. Now, we have tribal groups, for example, KBIC, that are interested in what happens here. We have environmental groups that are interested in what happens here. There are a lot of local people, sometimes generations, that have lived out here, and they want to find out, is this going to be a place that we can take our grandchildren to, or will it be destroyed? So my interest as a sociocultural anthropologist is not only what is there, but how people talk about what is there. And so that's what I started to explore. So you already know where you're at. I gave this talk in Vancouver where no one knew. So we won't spend a whole lot of time. But basically there's two areas. It's number 11 and 12 in the township of Marquette that we're interested in. And I specifically wanted to look at the area that Kennecott had been examining. And so the first thing that I did is I requested all of the documents that the archaeologists that were hired to look into this area looked at. And what I found, number one, is that they decided not to hire archaeologists from the Upper Peninsula. So they went to Cincinnati, Ohio instead. And they hired BHE Environmental. It's a group out of there. It's a CRM firm, which is what we call a cultural resource management firm. So that kind of raised a question mark in my own mind. The second thing that they did was that they took what's called a site analysis. Rather than looking at relationships between things in the landscape, they looked at things out of relationship. So if I wanted to find out if there was something in this room, I would only look, I wouldn't look at the connections between everything. And so that is what I wanted to examine as well when I went, to start exploring these issues. So BHE, they did two studies. The first study they did was within a 1 mile radius. Now, it's important to know that the Anishinaabe, who have occupied the UP for thousands of years, were hunters and gatherers. And there are several people in here who are in my anthropology classes, so they know that a hunter and gatherer uses a lot of land. They don't stay in a 1 mile radius. Even if you go to, just look at your own modern day life, and you usually travel outside of a 1 mile radius, So if you're looking at populations that often would go 40, 50 miles for a single food, it's a little absurd, So what I said is you have to use a methodology that fits the people you're studying, and you have to look outside of those boundaries. So this is a picture, of some of the people that have been protesting in order to raise awareness about what's there. When I started researching the issue, what I found is there were a lot of discussions about what was happening environmentally. Sulfide mining is not, something that's good for the environment, obviously, and it has a large and permanent impact. What I didn't find was anything that spoke to the cultural resources of the area, and I found that disturbing. And so I wanted to find out, well, what is there and why hasn't it been brought sort of to a more public medium? So this is one of the representatives from KBIC. And so I got into touch with several representatives from KBIC because that's the type of work that I've historically done. One of the projects that I worked on was the Hoover Dam project. I'm not sure how familiar anyone is here with Lake Mead and the Colorado River, but if you've been to Las Vegas or been in that area, there's a very, very narrow road that goes going south to Las Vegas. And there's a lot of trucks that travel over that area. And I was working with people from the University of Arizona that were hired to see would there be an impact if we expanded the road, because right now it bottlenecks and we have all these truckers trying to get into Las Vegas and they can't get in. And you can sit on the bridge for 6 hours sometimes, and other times you can get in 20 minutes, just depending. So that was a sacred landscape study. What we found was that it was sitting on a ritual site, that there was actually a number of different connected places. And so that's what I started investigating, is using that type of model here to see, in fact, was there anything besides the scanty archaeological footprint, which is what BHE Environmental was saying. So this is what I was, again, talking to an audience in Vancouver and that is not familiar, with sulfide mining. So I just wanted to give them a sense of what the impact can be when it goes unregulated. And I also have those little prints in my So clean water is something that is a sacred resource. It's sacred in every tradition if you look around the world. Water is sacred. Narratives are about the water. The people that I work with are the Paiutes. If you were to ask them traditionally where they were from, you wouldn't say, where are you from? You would say, where is your water? And they would say, you actually know something. You're not, like the rest of the anthropologists we've had to talk to or something. So water is absolutely critical. I recently returned from China where the parts of the Yellow River where I was staying were very, very, very polluted. I can't emphasize how badly they were polluted. And it's something you don't miss until it's not there anymore, and then you really know. So that's, again, another reason why I was interested in this project. So this is basically a picture, an overview of the Yellow Dog Plains and the Salmon Trout River. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a cultural landscape perspective. So a cultural landscape perspective is used by a lot of people in cultural geography, also in sociocultural anthropology, and I'm just going to give you some of the main ideas behind it. So one of the places is the World Heritage Center, and UNESCO uses it. It's basically, it explores how people and places co-create each other and the ways in which people imbue certain places with significance through embodied and cultural praxis. First, cultural landscapes are relational, being physical environments that are linked to each other through communities of practice. Archaeological methods for demonstrating these conditions and connections include the behavioral analysis of line of sight and distance from cultural resources, degrees of seclusion and visibility. This is especially true if it's a sacred area. Sometimes being secluded is just as valuable as being connected to different places. It can also be visibility. Evidence of previous ritual use is important, unique acoustic properties. Sometimes there are places that I'll study that if you go into a canyon, for example, it will echo, and that might contribute to its sense of sacredness and its use in different rituals by different ritual specialists. And also singular physiographic features. And what I mean by that is if you're traveling in a landscape that you don't know, and suddenly you see this outstanding feature that's different than everything else you've seen, a lot of times Indigenous peoples would have that be a sacred place, that it would be something that would be isolated. And what you'll see in some of the photographs I'm going to show you is that there is such a place here. Sometimes those places are considered to be important. Maybe they're considered to be guardians of the land, and other times it would be an area that would be associated with ritual events. The events and the cultural landscapes are functionally circumscribed. They encompass specific types of collective behavioral patterns rooted in and between places. For example, trade, migration, subsistence, or ritual activities. Third, cultural landscapes are culturally encoded. Each place is culturally encoded to match the primary belief systems of a given society. Consequently, the archaeological footprint of mobile societies may be defined through collective behaviors in relation to outstanding physiographic features, as well as more traditionally recognized forms of material culture. Fourth, cultural landscapes are dynamic and tend to augment functional and structural associations between emplaced populations over time. And fifth, cultural landscapes are nested. And this is a very important concept that I want to get across. They exist at different scales but integrated into a whole. For Native Americans, for example, these levels include from broadest to narrow scale, an eventscape, a holy land, songscapes, regional landscapes, ecoscapes, and landmarks. So you could have all of the UP being a cultural landscape if we found ritual places throughout and could connect those. So those are the types of arguments that will be put forth. Most recently, I've been in contact with SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, and last week they had a what's called Section 106 that has been filed, I believe, by the EPA. And what that means is they have to submit something, and they have to tell you two things. Number one, is there anything cultural there? And if there is, can we avoid it? Or can we, and this is a scary word, mitigate the damages? So those are the questions that are going on right now. What I've done is I've requested through FOIA that all of the information from 106 be sent here to NMU so we can actually go through it and find out what is in there, and also the possibility of doing what's called a TCP, a Traditional Cultural Property Nomination. This goes to the National Historic Register. It places the area in a special position. In other words, legally they can't necessarily stop the plows, but it certainly slows them down. And as you were mentioning, Teresa, in your talk, sometimes that's what a lot of this is about, is if there are cultural resources what are the mechanisms you can use legally in order to provide the most protection for those areas. So these are the different cultural landscape perspectives that we talked about: relational, being functionally circumcised, culturally encoded, dynamic, and nested. So one of the things from an archaeological perspective that's important is the shoreline you see is not the shoreline that was there 10,000 years ago. In other words, we're in a dynamic landscape. And when my predecessor came here to teach at NMU, she was told by her advisor that she was ruining her life and her career by going to the UP because there was no archaeology and there was nothing, therefore, to study. So at that time, I think there were 6 archaeological sites that were mapped throughout the UP. Now there are multiple archaeological sites that are mapped throughout the UP. And one of the things they found out is a lot of this stuff goes back 10 to 11,000 years ago. So a lot of it has been having the methods in order to study this. So one of the issues that needs to be examined is both looking at what are the archaeologists capable of studying, and in those cases, where should we be looking for resources? Where should we be looking for material culture? Because if you look at the landscape you see now, it's not the same one that used to be here. So we have to think outside of the borders. This is actually a picture of Migiziwasin, which also means Eagle Rock. And I spoke with Summer Cohen from KBIC before and also presented this paper and asked permission to share this information with you today. This is a sacred site for the KBIC. This is a place that is important for a number of reasons. One of the most important reasons is that, well, there's 2 things. Number one, it's part of a ritual landscape. Now, that's certainly something the mining companies don't want you to know, and they certainly don't have anything to gain from having that knowledge put out there. And in terms of the tribal involvement, in terms of KBIC and any other groups, there's 2 issues that happen. One is sometimes sites are more protected by being secretive about them, by not saying anything. And sometimes it gets to a point where the only protection is to let everyone know. So it's a very, kind of touch and go issue, and you just have to decide on a case-by-case scenario. KBIC has decided to bring forward some of this information with the intent of providing protection that may not otherwise be there. This is actually the eastern terminus of a ritual landscape. Now, the reason it's part of this ritual landscape is because there was a large migration that the Anishinaabe went through, starting with the St. Lawrence Seaway and then making their way through the UP. At every place that they stopped along this route, they would perform special ceremonies, and they would create a Medewan Lodge and a place where the ceremonies were conducted. One of those is within the line of sight of Migiwasin. You can actually see it from there. And so this is very important because from an archaeological perspective, line of sight is one of the ways that you look at a cultural landscape. What can you see when you're in one place? And so the fact that this is connected to that connects us to a much larger ritual landscape than what you see here. I've also learned informally through people that there are 5 or 6 other physiographic features, dramatic rock outcrops like this, that are related within a 100-mile radius. So that's a second way that a ritual landscape is being encoded here. And what we see is that it has continued to have use over time. In the previous picture, in the previous slide, you see some of the prayer ties. So people are currently going out to this area, but they have been going out there for different reasons over time. So one of the things that we'll be doing this summer is getting people together to do what are called ethnographic interviews, to share their stories, because the story has power. And the more stories you have, the more power you have. And if it becomes an issue where you have only one individual talking, usually that's how the story dies. But when you get lots of people talking, lots of elders with different experiences over time, then eventually what we see is the emergence of a true cultural landscape. And these are recorded in a lot of different places. So I found a lot of historic documents where people talked about the cultural significance of the Yellow Duck Plains. This isn't just something that someone brewed up last week. It has a historic and an archaeological basis. This is a picture of a Medewan lodge. These lodges, again, were built at the sites along the migration route, and this one is in Lance. And it is one of many places that we hope to document and to show and demonstrate how they're all connected. So what we see with VHE Environmental, what they did is what's called a site-by-site analysis. So they went in and they, if you were to imagine this room was a cultural landscape, they looked at each table, and that was the story of the room. It's like the room has 5 tables, rather than saying, well, there's actually people sitting at the tables and they're doing something while they're sitting there. So we're trying to basically flesh out the story. Another important feature and cultural characteristic is that there is what's called AAA Road, which is built right on top of an Indian trail. So this is something that from an archaeological perspective, people don't necessarily see immediately. They might be looking for foundations of houses. And that's not to say that there are actually several historic features that were found on site. But this is a trail that actually goes and connects everyone there to Marquette and other places throughout the UP. So there's a very complex system of trails that we'll be mapping this summer as well as a mechanism to demonstrate what's going on. Some of those connected people to villages here in Marquette. There's over 6 different villages. There's also several places that were burial sites. And so there's a lot going on that people, especially if they're not trained in UP archaeology, might not know to look at. Another issues are connected to early archaic sites. One is at Silver Lake and another is at the Gordo site. And there are over 45 different sites within Silver Lake, and then Gordo site has approximately 23. These are some of the oldest sites in the Upper Peninsula, and archaeologists are very interested in these places. So one of our jobs is to demonstrate, basically because of their close proximity, that they are relevant among the hunting and gathering populations that were here. And finally, linguistically. If you look at the linguistics, you see that there's actually a number of place names that are all in Anishinaabe. And then as you go along, some of them are a mixture of Anishinaabe and French, and then eventually they're replaced by English names. So this is another place where narrative can be very powerful in telling a story that hasn't been told or has not been told for a while. And so what anthropology can do is by using the 4 subfields, by looking at the archaeological record, by looking at the social-cultural record, by looking at the linguistic record, and then sometimes physical archaeology, you bring together a much more complex story and one that can complement the environmental stories that are currently being told. Finally, here's another example. A line of evidence is the ethnobotany. There is stuff growing in the Yellow Duck Plains together that wouldn't naturally grow together. There are certain plant species that don't like each other. And so the fact that they grow together is indicative that some of the indigenous populations have purposely put them together. And so we can use the ethnobotany. In this case, the huckleberries and the wild blueberries grow together. They don't grow together in other places, from what I'm told. So this is another area where we're going to investigate just to see what we can bring together. So there's a lot of issues going on, but the main point with this talk was just simply to outline some of the areas of evidence that we're going to be exploring in much greater detail, but with the purpose of doing 2 things. Number one is, doing a traditional cultural property nomination. Right now I'm in contact with SHPO, and they want all of the information we can possibly bring them, to the table right now. So if anyone has anything, I'm currently putting together like a preliminary document to send them that they have to consider with all of the information they have from the EPA. And then later on, we'll do a more formal traditional cultural property nomination. So that's everything that I have. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Yes? I would have to look at the maps again, but it's been quite some time. What happens is the surveyors, they made an error, which was they were supposed to have the AAA trail next to the Indian Trail, and they ended up going right on top of it because of putting the stakes in the wrong area. There is a 1930s historic atlas that has a lot of the Indian trails in it. And so if you are interested, I can give you the reference afterwards, and you could actually go and look at the actual, maps and everything. And that's another line of evidence that we'll be using a lot are different maps from different time periods, because that helps to demonstrate the presence of the American Indian, especially Anishinaabe population. Sure. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead. I have a draft, yes. I have no problem with that as long as Summer is okay with it, then I would be happy to. I think that, again, there's kind of two strategies. One is to be silent and one is to speak out. And I think that the sentiment is at this point we need to stand together and speak out. Yes? Mm-hmm. Hmm.
I'm very superstitious. Do you have any knowledge of that idea or that story? And if indeed, what an interpretation be that harm to come?
Well, yes. Well, tricksters are tricksters. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with tricksters or coyote stories, but the coyote is always up to something, and he's I believe, I have heard stories, different stories, narratives about Eagle Rock and some of the things, the connections out there and the different beings. What you find in a lot of Native American traditions and a lot of Earth, related groups of people is the connection and the recognition that the Earth is alive, that everything is alive, and so there's an honoring of that and a stewardship that goes along with that. But there are spirits, that are believed to sometimes, have other agendas. So I think that's certainly a possibility. And I've even heard stories of there are people that can shift the weather, for example, in some of the groups that I've worked with. And they'll talk about accidentally, making it too strong, things like that. So one of the things we'll be doing this summer is gathering all of those ethnographies together to talk about, in what ways is this an important ritual landscape and what are the specific spirits that are associated with the water, with the outcrop that I showed you, with a lot of other things in the area. Yes? The first thing that I'll be doing is creating a traditional cultural property nomination that will go to the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, and then also to the National Register of Historic Places. And there are certain qualifications to get on that register. You have to demonstrate either archaeological characteristics or cultural characteristics of significance. But if it gets on the register, it's much harder to. It's not that you cannot develop in those areas, but it becomes progressively harder. And so this is one way of perhaps slowing down a process that does have an impact or can potentially alter some Anishinaabe landscapes significantly, and in landscapes that over many years many different groups have become attached to. So one of the key issues is, especially with the types of mining that they proposed. The first one was to drill directly into the rock outcrop. I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with it, but they just wanted to go right through it. And they still want to. And from like a cultural perspective, that's truly a desecration. That would be like going to it could be to the cathedral here or something, and just dynamiting it. It would be similar in a lot of people's minds. They're international. I think they're in England are their headquarters. Usually what they do is they try to have multiple names, which for a company, so that's one mechanism that they kind of defer responsibility if something goes wrong, or if they do something that is considered to be inappropriate. They'll just say the headquarters didn't know. But they're in Britain. They're also, Salt Lake City, I think, is one of their main headquarters in the United States. Yes, Rio Tinto is their parent company, and I'm not sure how familiar everyone is with them, but they have quite a record, of various environmental infractions. So that's. Mm. Right, right. Mm-hmm. Algetics has written a book for people who are interested in, some of the sort of the global ramifications of different mining groups and environmental issues. What's the name of that? Resource Rebels. So I would recommend that as like a starting place for people that are interested. I think it has a lot of good information. The New Resource Wars is another good one, right? Right. So there's a lot of good information. A lot of it's empowering people to recognize what your rights are, and cultural issues are very important in this topic. And that's why I was surprised when I came here that no one was talking about the cultural issues that were connected to the topic. What's that? Oh, okay. Right. So that's something that we'll just keep looking at and developing as we go. But there's a lot at stake. I mean, the issue is anthropology. We just go and document things as thoroughly as we possibly can, and then what people do with that information is kind of out of our control. But it does sometimes provide a mechanism to substantiate arguments that would otherwise not have the foundations intellectually to really combat someone, especially at a legal level. So this is where, sometimes anthropologists, other social scientists too, will be called into courtrooms in order to, really analyze issues that are beyond the issues that a mining company might truly understand. So this is something that is an advantage we have. Yes? No, I have not. I heard that Summer was looking for anyone she could get, so I don't know. So possibly, and I would be happy to do so, Yes. Well, that's what I need to find out. The biggest key right now is within the next 2 weeks, I'm going to try to flood SHPO with all the information that I can, just to at least put out the lines of evidence, so that they have to consider them, and they said that they will, as they go through the 106 issues. But I think to do a TCP nomination properly, it's going to take all summer, to do the ethnographic interviews, to go out and map the sites, it's just a lot of archival work. So it just takes time. This is National Historic. Basically, the EPA is the one that's doing Section 106, but 106 is federal legislation that they have to follow legally. So. Because it's public land. Right. Yes. It's 45% of the land, I believe, is public, and then the remainder, maybe maybe 55% is private. Anytime you have public land, you have to look at what the cultural issues are, and also if there are going to be any effects, how to mitigate it and or avoid it completely. So they know they have to do that, and the question is, do they have enough information to make a fair and balanced decision? And so when you hire people from out of state, that's just one mechanism not to find any information because you have the wrong people exploring it. You need to get expertise. Even a lot of the archaeologists that I spoke with in Vancouver, they said that's methodologically very suspect, that it's not appropriate. Right, and the way we substantiate it is by looking at all the stories, looking at the stories of the contemporary, elders, looking at stories that are sometimes recorded. You just kind of have to dig through a lot of piles of paper, and eventually you find these connections. So I'm inviting scholars that are interested and trying to rally as many people as possible to work on these lines of evidence. So it's important just to get the project done. Yes. Yeah, go ahead. Right. So, yes, Michael.
Very old rock, or perhaps some of the oldest rocks on Earth. And I'm wondering, since the oceanography made a great migration, let's say in the 1600s, how many sheets of debris have risen up, pine needles,
Right.
berries, bird poop,
Right.
I wonder if there are some symbols on the pictographs.
It's
They'd still be visible.
right. It's called periodite rock, which isn't necessarily the most common for rock art. But I think certainly you have the accretion of soil over time. One of the issues in the Yellow Dog Plains is that there has historically been a lot of mining, and because of that, a lot of lumber, and timbering, and so they've gone through and disturbed the archaeological record a lot. Even with that, they were still able to find different lithic scatters, which indicated people were going there, if nothing else, to go hunting. And we also have identified there's historic structures, from the period when they were going in to do the logging. The argument for Kennecott will be it doesn't count because it's a historic structure, but the ethnographic and ethnohistoric record will indicate that a lot of KBIC people were actually working, doing the logging because they, it was very, very hard work, and it was hard to get people to go out and do the work. And so they tended to recruit people that were vulnerable economically, and so they tended to recruit a lot of American Indians. They also recruited criminals, and they would say, you have a choice. You can go to jail, or you can go and cut down a tree. So those were, some of the people that ended up doing it. So that's just another example of an area where we can make a cultural connection that's not one that they're going to make. So, yes, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
Then to other white organizations, when a university does this, and then you take this science up the road to this organization that you're going to use, is probably white people too, right?
Well,
Whether it's not or not, right? But that's the way it used to be.
right. I would say two things. I agree with you. There is a problem that's the way the system works. I agree completely. Having said that, I work with a lot of Native American archaeologists. I work with a lot of Native American anthropologists. So it's not a racial thing necessarily, but it is the system that we have to work with now. And no, I agree with what you're saying, though. It's like the fact that it's not true until you have a social scientist go out and say it's true is a problem, because then we get into knowledge claims and knowledge systems and what counts as knowledge, and all of that's very important as well. Absolutely. And so what hopefully this work will do to some extent is to help, continue to support different types of knowledge claims and the validity of those that are outside of the academia. Yes, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Right. And then within anthropology, what I would say that's happening, especially in applied anthropology, is like I work with a lot of people that train Native Americans and have them involved and integrated in the process. So the goal isn't to, create lines. The goal is to create communication and connections and empowerment for everyone. But it is a system that's inherently flawed, and that's, I guess, the best we have to work with at the moment. But that doesn't mean we should accept it. We just